This and more coming up on The Whitney Reynolds Show.
The purveyors of history are those who can write it down and tell it. And so for me, I wanted to set out to tell our story.
This is a really personal story for me. You know, it's even though it's about a community that I'm not a part of, the story at large is really about home and what it means to us.
Am I more important than my connection? So yeah, I helped a lot of people. I learned so much about trauma and it felt good.
I was just like, oh, this is something I like to do. And then I was like, wait, this is something I can use to change my life.
Hello and welcome to The Whitney Reynolds Show. Today we are meeting people who went back to their roots. Join us as we hear stories of how a person's past is impacting their present. Here we believe your story matters.
I think the resilience started like when my family said, this is really bad, like when you wake up, you have to like keep going.
I was that story, the one that needed a safe space.
The key to success is taking risks.
So we created it.
Everybody fails, everybody takes that one big hit. What's important is standing back up and keep going.
You are watching The Whitney Reynolds Show. Be careful.
Our roots, how we were planted, where we come from, the origin of us. This is the story of truth, trauma, and transformation. What was once planted bloomed. Now we want to introduce you to Dr. Frankie.
So most of my life, really, the first half, was lived as somebody else in a very different way. And you know, you get programmed and you get taught and you learn how to be what people want you to be.
Wow. Okay, so let's walk our viewers back through these 32 years of kind of living another life and how that started for you.
I was 6 years old, and one morning my parents I walked into my parents' bedroom as kind of we often did, and they're like, Frankie, you're not going to school today. I'm like, what? I didn't understand it. It wasn't summer vacation. I wasn't sick. I was like, what's up? And they didn't really say what's up. They say, we're going downtown and we're going for some tests at a hospital.
Do you remember the emotion you felt when they said you're going to a hospital downtown and you're like, but I'm not sick? Did it stir up maybe something else was wrong?
It was confusing. It really was confusing. I don't even know that I had emotion that I can access at this point, honestly. And I've spent a lot of time kind of reviewing. Dissociation or disconnection is such a powerful protection that we all have. So I ended up going for psych testing. They took me to therapy for 6 years, once a week. You know, back then, you know, in the 60s and 70s, being gay was a disorder. Wow, it was in the DSM as a disorder. So,
well, and I want to note that you're saying this here because so often when we hear these tough stories, a lot of people will say, you know, we have so much farther to go, and we do. But I just want to show we've come far. If that was a disorder then, and now, I mean, I'm thinking so much has changed.
That's right. That's right. And it really activated my father in some way that was profound. And so I went to therapy for 6 years, once a week. My behavior didn't fit the norm. And I remember looking at my uncles, act like Uncle Jerry, act like Uncle Bob. I remember knowing that I was wrong. That was the biggest thing. You are wrong. So what ended up happening, I got into medical school and I got accepted to Harvard, which was a huge thing for my family. Oh my goodness, Frankie's going to Harvard. I worked in a hospital that only worked with people who were homeless and had no insurance and had chronic mental illness. Very overwhelming for me, and again, I had no idea why. So I got so stirred up by sitting with these people. I was a doctor and I was kind of treating them, and then I shot myself into therapy. This was the second time in therapy, but this time it was my choice. I got to the place where I tolerated who I was independent of who I would lose.
Dr. Frankie was married to a woman and later divorced. Being a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and a well-respected trauma therapist, he knew he too had to put in the hard work to understand his story and what shaped his current situation.
The biggest thing for me was, am I more important than my connections? So yeah, I helped a lot of people. I learned so much about trauma, and it felt good to help people while I was doing my own healing.
When did you know you needed to be vulnerable with your story?
So one of the things, so I really do teach all throughout the world now. I teach therapists, I teach, and I love teaching. I'm an extrovert, I love being around people. And I remember at one of Bessel's early trauma conferences, I was sitting in the audience, I was gonna do a workshop. It's like, we're all on this podium talking about what needs to happen for trauma survivors. Like, that's weird. Like, most of us have trauma histories, why can't we say that? It was a very us and them, and I'm like, this us and them mentality is perpetuating trauma dynamic. Trauma is a power differential.
These are the moments that made Dr. Frankie not only blossom, but create a garden gate, one that's open for others visiting old trauma. His new book, To Be Loved, is now out.
In Cabrini Green, it don't matter how old you are, how much money you got, how big or tall, or small.
We sat down with the cast and director of We Grown Now, a movie that takes us back in time to the days of Cabrini Green, a housing project in Chicago. Tell me, why did you choose to tell this type of story?
This is a really personal story for me. You know, it's even though it's about a community that I'm not a part of, the story at large is really about home and what it means to us. And I'd come back to Chicago after a long time of being away. And, you know, I'd grown up knowing about Cabrini Green, knowing about the public housing projects in Chicago. But by the time I graduated, it was the last of the high rises had been demolished. And I was interested in exploring this relationship that this community has to a place that they called home that also no longer exists. And 1992 felt like the right time period for this because it was such a transitional moment. You know, what happened to Dontrell Davis really was this turning point in the neighborhood. It was this loss that really rocked the community and changed, in the eyes of many, the future of public housing here.
Cabrini Green had many stories that lived within the gates, some happy and some extremely tragic, like the one of Dontrell Davis, who was gunned down on his way to school and passed away. He was just 7 years old.
You ever think about what it would be like outside of here? Wow, this is where we're from. Such a big road out there. So much I want to do.
Yeah, you know, I was looking at you two, and y'all are just adorable. And you did such a great job for putting me, as I was watching it, in your seats. Like, I was thinking 1992, I would have been 8 or 9. And I was thinking about what it would be like. I grew up in Southern Oklahoma, so a different story of home. But then I thought about the Chicago kids that were living in it, and then the dreams and the aspiration that could come out of there. What was it like for each of you playing these roles and knowing you were telling a deeper story?
You know, I'm from Chicago, so, you know, me playing this role, it's like this was meant for me, because I've wanted to, you know, express Chicago in certain ways that, you know, sometimes couldn't be expressed.
To be put in a completely different environment, that was probably one of the toughest parts for me to perform.
Helping us better understand the reality behind the movie is film critic Patrick McDonald, who actually coached a team in Cabrini Green during the years the movie was set.
They have several scenes in the movie that are set in what they called the low rises. They were called the white buildings back in the day. And that's where the students I tutored lived. So it was very familiar to me. Now, the high-rise situation, which was in the background of the field at the time, and that's a universal theme. We're all humans. We're all trying to exist. And, this country has been reckoning with its racial disparities. As we fast forward to the 1990s, you would think some of these things would have been dealt with, but they hadn't at that point. And we're still reckoning with our divides in a sense. But so to create a bit of empathy just for my personal soul was very important. And I think that we grown now gives us a sense of the universality of the human experience, especially in childhood. We all grow up somewhere, and these kids grew up there, and they had to adapt and survive, just like we had to adapt and survive in our childhoods.
You're just mad because I'm leaving.
You're not a baby anymore. You're grown now, and you know right from wrong.
I have to say, the beauty of the stories that came out, so often we hear that narrative of what people think it was, or maybe what they assume. And I love the way you pulled out these really beautiful stories from that.
Well, first of all, Jason is a single father, right? Living in Cabrini Green. And I haven't seen that really displayed a lot as far as African-American dad in that particular situation and in the housing project. And, it was I try to play Jason as honest as possible, where you could tell, he didn't have a lot of emotional connection. He was focused on basically providing.
Yeah, there's a culturally dominant narrative about Cabrini Green being a very unsafe place. And that is the story that we all are very familiar with. But I think what I was interested in was the domestic stories, the stories about family, and the stories of joy and, the beauty in this place.
Now to another woman who honors her roots through creativity.
I'm a second generation artist, and I've always just been doing what I love. And I am actually pinching myself too. How do you land in a place where you're helping those who inspired you, and actually just a catalyst for change and educating the world on the Black tradition in American dance.
Princess Mhoon is a second generation artist, one whose leadership was even recognized by former First Lady Michelle Obama with Black Women Who Dance. Her passion for dance was generational, and once she discovered it, truly became a mission, one to preserve and leave a legacy.
You're doing more than even just education on dance. Going back to your grandparents' story of coming up to Chicago, facing adversity. I mean, that's part of history that we need to remember.
African Americans, we were brought here against our will, but we made the best of it. And there's been different iterations of history where we kind of had to pack our bags and migrate and figure out, okay, how do we make it? The game is changing. And so for my grandparents, their parents were entrepreneurs in the South, and with Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, they had to leave. And so we found our hope here in Chicago. Some of our family is in Detroit. There's a whole migration called the Black Migration, where that happened, where thousands and thousands of Black families left the South, and they went to New York, and they went to Ohio and Chicago and Detroit. And so we found ourselves here, and in the 70s is when my parents found the arts. And in most cultural training, there's meaning behind everything. So if you're doing Bharatanatyam in India, this movement means something. The eye movement means something. And so in our traditions, every song, every word, every gesture means something. And so we're learning that. And even if you're training in ballet, ballet is to tell a story through dance. It's kind of cliche that we have to even be talking about this in 2024, but this is our history.
And this is also very important that we don't forget, because that is how we keep moving forward.
The purveyors of history are those who can write it down and tell it. Right?
Wow.
And so for me, I wanted to set out to tell our story. And I went back and obtained my master's in history. I'm like a history nerd. And my research was the black tradition in American dance, African American history, and so my thesis was on Black dance in Chicago.
Wow.
Yes, and for years I've been trying to figure out how to get back here to preserve and really work on that.
The Chicago Black Dance Project unites a cohort of Black dance companies to learn from one another. And not to our surprise, at the helm, Princess Mhoon. During her leadership, the project also formed a wing of archiving and preserving the history of Black dance.
Take us on that journey of trying to build up a section that's this big.
It starts with just kind of small bites. What is history? History is our stories. That's all it is. It's our tangible items that we leave behind that leave little bitty cookie crumbs for those who want to know what happened. And so we started out with a series of oral interviews with folks over the past 50 or 60 years who have made contributions. And so we have a great collection of oral interviews where they tell these stories. This is how this company was started. This is who was married to who, and this is why this happened, and this is why that company closed down, and then the new one opened because that happened. So
Wow.
Those stories. We've gone into garages and collected posters, programs. You could see who was dancing at that time.
What do you hope people take away from what you're building?
One thing we look for in the arts is equity and equal access. We need equal funding. We need equal opportunities. And with that, we can kind of level the playing field for how the arts is perceived, Black arts is perceived, and how we allow these generations the ability to see themselves. We talked a little bit about that earlier, right? Because if our young people don't see themselves, there's going to be a lack of hope.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Everyone known me for carrying my violin around. Like, it kind of was my security blanket, and then I had realized it was a tool more than that, you know, because I was just like, oh, this is something I like to do, and then I was like, wait, this is something I can use to change my life. So then I would start buying more than one, you know.
So let's talk about that, because you grew up in Chicago.
Yes.
And how would you describe the neighborhood you grew up in?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Austin community on the west side of Chicago.
And for people that don't know the Austin community, can you tell them a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, typically, the Austin community doesn't have the best reputation, especially because of the crime rate. But as far as the west side, it's one of the biggest communities, as well as North Lawndale. But typically in Austin, kind of was very rough for the most part, as far as like the demeanor. I feel like I had to learn to thrive in the area that kind of felt like it was like a lot of restrictions on like just being like open and out, and like just being extroverted, being just being something that people weren't like okay with seeing.
That's so interesting. You know, one thing I do love about your story is that when we've seen stories coming from the Austin neighborhood or the west side, sometimes they're very tragic, and you're one that's saying, hey, I grew up there and I am making my own story. And a lot of that had to do with the people that went before you, like your parents.
Yeah, my mom taught for CPS, Chicago Public Schools, for over 30 years, and she was very prominent in the community, and very much more prominent in my own life. It wasn't until I got older I realized she was setting a foundation in my life. And after that, I started having more success, but at the time I didn't see it. So my mom basically helped guide me to be an independent woman, and a very like strong independent. My mom is so strong. Yes.
When did you know you had this gift of Windie Indie, your real name, Brenda?
Yes.
Inside you?
Yes, well, it's funny, I'm named after my mother too. So my mom's name was Brenda as well. So that was how I changed my name to get like my own identity. But
so you just you said, hey, I'm gonna be Windie Indie.
I was 17 years old. I was in high school still, and I knew when I was playing the violin and I started kind of like experimenting over hip hop, I knew like I was doing something different. I was like, I need another name. Like, I can't keep doing this and people still remember me as Brenda. So that's when I was just like, just being creative and just trying to figure out what other name I wanted to use. So that just stuck out to me.
Well, Windie is very close to Whitney, so I would say well done. I love it.
I'm a go-getter. My mom is a go-getter. Thank you.
You really are. I followed your Facebook page. I'm like, there she is, like self-funding your projects.
Yes.
You know, your dad was also a go-getter.
Yes.
He made these wood pieces.
Yes.
And just made a way and did it with his hands, and you're doing the same thing with your hands.
Amen.
Making a way.
Amen. And my during my childhood, I've seen my dad a few times, and the times I saw him, he always brought me something that he created. And I was just like, oh my goodness, like it was just kind of like almost like defining my future, knowing that I can create things from nothing.
The type of music you play is unique.
Thank you.
How do you describe it?
Yeah, so I play the violin, and because of this classical instrument, it comes out classical. But I listen to hip hop so much, you know?
Yeah.
So when I put the two together, it's a fusion. So many people who love classical music will find themselves like, I'm loving hip hop. And so many people who love hip hop find themselves thinking, I'm loving classical. So I'm not even realizing like I'm bringing these different groups together. I'm just doing two things I love.
And we have you booked on like the perfect time of your career because you have a new song coming out.
Yes, I have a new song coming out called Guide Me, and I just wrote it recently, and it's about just trusting God and trusting the path. And sometimes I will, at least the last single I had was 5 years ago, and it was about things taking time. So I feel like, okay, well, it's been enough time.
Yeah, you're like 5 years is enough. It's time for a new album release.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like, I have a performance career where, thank God that performing have supported me my entire life. But this is a new venture, like recording songs and like, you know, coming on shows like this. This is kind of new for me because like I have so like much character built in what I'm comfortable in. So I'm like, all right, I trust God to guide me even in the moments where I'm uncomfortable because I know it's gonna work out and I know I have good intentions.
Today's show has me asking the question, how are your roots impacting you? Remember, your story matters. Coming up on the Whitney Reynolds Show's current season.
You know, as time went on, my father became very possessive with my mother. They were going through a divorce. And, you know, one day he decided that it was time for it all to end. And he took his life and my mother's life.
That is so hard. That is one of those, you know, you said it very eloquently right now. Of, you know, he took his life, took my mother's, and I had that distraction. But in that moment, that had to be probably, I mean, how old were you?
18. 18, yeah.
And you'd already found that love for food because of the chaos.
Well, I think I found the love of food. Yeah, I guess so. Because when I was 14, I really wanted a change of life. We grew up very poor and wanted to have something greater than what I was surrounded with. And I think obtaining that first job, working in the kitchen, washing dishes, it gave me a light of, you know, being able to obtain something, you know, watching people's reaction when they eat something and having something transform in the moment was fascinating for me. As 14 years old, like that's what I fell in love with. I started setting goals as to who I wanted to work for.